The mountain was going to kill them all, and Deputy Stephen Fletcher knew it. He stood at the base of the Rattlesnake Ridge trail, snow driving sideways into his face, his horse blowing hot breath into the frozen January air of 1883, and he stared up at what should have been the only passage through the San Jacinto Range into the valley below. Should have been, because what lay before him now was not a trail. It was a graveyard of boulders and shattered pine, a wall of rock and ice that had come down in last night's avalanche, sealing the path as completely and cruelly as if God himself had drawn a curtain across the mountain. Behind him, the wagon containing 12-year-old Clara Duchamp was dying. Not metaphorically. The girl had a fever that had climbed past the point of conversation and entered the territory of last rites, and Dr. Hensley in Silver Creek was the only man within 200 miles who had the medicine and the knowledge to treat the infection that was eating her alive from the inside out. The Duchamp family had sent for Stephen specifically because he was the fastest rider in Callow County, the man who knew these mountains better than his own reflection, the deputy who had never, in 8 years of service, failed to find a way through. He was staring at failure right now. He turned back to look at the wagon. Old Emmett Duchamp sat hunched on the buckboard, his weathered face carved into lines of silent terror, his hands gripping the reins of horses that could feel the cold through their shoes. And there, beside the wagon on a bay mare that moved with the precise elegance of an animal that had been trained by someone who understood horsemanship at a fundamental level, sat Abigail Winslow. She was watching him with those sharp green eyes that had unsettled him since the first moment she arrived in Callow 3 months ago. The new schoolteacher from Philadelphia, who had somehow taken up residence in this brutal frontier and refused to be broken by it. She wore a practical wool coat, men's riding trousers tucked into leather boots that had seen serious use, and her dark auburn hair was pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat that kept most of the snow from her face. She was reading him. He could see it in the slight tilt of her head, the way her gaze moved from his face to the blocked trail and back again, calculating something he hadn't yet arrived at. "It's impassable," he said. His voice came out harder than he intended, stripped of any apology. The whole upper face came down. "I've ridden this range for 8 years, Miss Winslow, and I am telling you that there is no way through Rattlesnake Ridge tonight." She did not react the way he expected. She did not panic. She did not cry. She did not defer to his authority with that quiet, deflated obedience he'd come to recognize in women who had been taught that men's assessments were final. Instead, she looked at the mountain. She looked at it the way a person looks at a problem they have already begun solving. "What about the eastern face?" she asked. "Sheer cliff." "Above the timberline," he paused. "There's no trail above the timberline." She turned those green eyes on him, and there was something in them that made the back of his neck prickle. "I didn't say there was a trail," she said. "I asked about the terrain." It was that moment, that exact exchange, that started everything. Not the avalanche, not the fever, not the desperate race against a January night that was dropping toward temperatures that would freeze a man solid if he sat still long enough. It was that sentence. The way she turned his certainty sideways and offered him something his certainty had no room for. He had no idea yet that Abigail Winslow had spent 3 summers in these specific mountains before she ever set foot in Callow, conducting a geological survey for the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad that had employed her as a cartographic assistant, a job she had secured by demonstrating a mastery of topographical mapping that surpassed every male applicant the railroad had considered. He had no idea that she had walked every accessible face of the San Jacinto Range with a compass and a notebook, that she had documented fissures and game trails and seasonal paths that appeared on no official map, because no official surveyor had ever bothered to look that carefully, because the railroad had ultimately chosen a southern route, and her maps had been filed away and forgotten. He had no idea she had those maps in her saddlebag. He was about to find out. But before any of that, before the trail and the mountain and the night that would change everything between them. There was Callow, Colorado, in the autumn of 1882, and there was the beginning of an antipathy that had only been waiting for the right pressure to reveal itself as something else entirely. Abigail Winslow arrived in Callow on the 14th of September on the afternoon stage from Denver, and she arrived without ceremony, without a welcoming committee, and without any of the hesitation that the townspeople had expected from a schoolteacher from the East. She stepped down from the coach with a leather satchel over one shoulder and a large wooden trunk being handed down behind her, and she looked at the main street of Callow, Colorado, with the expression of a person who had already made their accounting of a place and found it acceptable. Callow was a cattle town of about 400 people, perched at the edge of the San Jacinto foothills in a valley that caught the worst of the winter winds and the best of the summer light. It had 2 saloons, a dry goods store, a hardware merchant, a small church, a sheriff's office, and a schoolhouse that had been without a permanent teacher for nearly 2 years since old Haverford Crane had retired to his daughter's farm in Kansas. The town's children were running feral in the interim, which was a concern to the parents and a matter of genuine civic alarm to the town council. The council had advertised as far away as Philadelphia, and Abigail Winslow had answered the advertisement at the age of 27, with a teaching certificate from the Philadelphia Normal School, 3 letters of commendation from previous employers, and a personal statement that described her qualifications in such precise and unambiguous terms that Council Chairman Horace Pell had read it twice before he could quite believe a woman had written it. She had taken the job because Philadelphia had become suffocating. Because she had spent 2 years teaching in a girls' school on Chestnut Street, where the curriculum was confined to penmanship, basic arithmetic, French vocabulary, and the social graces appropriate to a young woman of good family, and she had found herself slowly going mad with the smallness of it. She wanted mountains. She wanted space. She wanted a place where the work was real and the stakes were genuine and nobody cared whether she poured tea with her right hand or her left. Callow was not what she had imagined. It was harder, louder, more chaotic, and more beautiful than any description had prepared her for. The mountains rose behind it like a promise, snow-capped even in September, and the air had a clarity that Philadelphia had never known. She breathed it in and felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for years. Deputy Stephen Fletcher was not part of her first day's settling. He appeared on her second morning in Callow, on the doorstep of the schoolhouse where she was conducting her initial inventory of books and supplies, and he appeared without knocking, which she noted immediately as a point of data about his character. He was tall. She registered that first, in the way that forced you to adjust your awareness of the space he occupied. Broad through the shoulders and chest, with the kind of lean, functional musculature that came from physical work rather than deliberate cultivation. Dark hair under a deputy's hat that showed real sun and weather wear along the brim. A jaw that was built for stubbornness, strong and square, with a shadow of beard that suggested he shaved when he remembered to rather than when convention required. His eyes were the particular gray of storm clouds building over the mountains, and they were conducting the same inventory of her that she was conducting of him, except that his assessment had an additional quality hers did not. He was deciding whether she was going to be a problem. "Miss Winslow," he said, not a question. "Deputy Fletcher," she replied, since she had already been briefed on the town's law enforcement by Mrs. Garrett at the boarding house. "Is there something I can help you with, or did you come to inspect the premises?" He had the good grace to almost look uncomfortable, which she found interesting. "Council asked me to come by. Make sure you'd settled in without any trouble." "I have settled in without any trouble," she said, "as you can see." He looked around the schoolroom. She had already reorganized it from its previous state of disorganized neglect, sorting the existing books by subject and age appropriateness, cataloging the supplies, identifying the structural repairs that needed attention, and drafting a note to the council about the heating stove that was missing one of its damper plates. He took this in with those storm-gray eyes and seemed, for a moment, genuinely uncertain what to say about it. "You work fast," he said finally. "I work efficiently," she corrected. There's a distinction. She did not mean it as a challenge. It was simply accurate, but she saw his jaw tighten fractionally and she filed that away. He was a man who was accustomed to being the most competent person in a room and was not entirely certain what to do with competition. "School opens Monday," he said, as if she might not know this. "I'm aware," she said pleasantly. "I set the date." He left shortly after and she returned to her inventory, and she told herself the slight heat in her face was from the effort of moving heavy boxes and not from the particular quality of his attention when he looked at her. The first weeks of school established Abigail's reputation in Callow with the decisive speed of a cattle brand. She was strict but warm, demanding but fair, and she taught with an infectious intensity that had the children of Callow, who had previously viewed school as a form of imprisonment, actually looking forward to Monday mornings. She taught reading and arithmetic, but she also taught geography with real maps spread across the floor, and natural science using specimens she collected herself on Saturday mornings when she rode out into the hills on the bay mare she had rented from the livery, and history with the kind of unflinching honesty that occasionally alarmed the parents but kept the older students riveted. She taught the children about the Ute people who had lived in these mountains for centuries before the settlers came, not as a romantic footnote, but as a complex civilization with sophisticated knowledge of the land that the settlers were still failing to adequately understand. This generated some complaint from certain quarters of the town's population, and Abigail listened to those complaints with respectful patience and then continued teaching exactly as she saw fit, because she had a teaching certificate and a contract, and she was not, under any circumstances, going to pretend that the history of this land was simpler than it was. Stephen Fletcher heard about her teaching. He heard about it in the way you hear about everything in a town of 400 people, which is to say through the medium of the general store, the barber shop, and Margaret Tully at the post office, who had opinions about everything and shared them with democratic generosity. Some of what he heard made him uneasy. Some of it made him thoughtful. None of it was what he had expected from a schoolteacher from Philadelphia. He had expected trouble of the fragile, unintentional kind. He had expected someone who would find Callow overwhelming within a month and be on the stage back to Denver by Christmas. He had not expected someone who rode out alone into the San Jacinto foothills on Saturday mornings, with a geological hammer tucked in her saddlebag, which he saw with his own eyes one morning, when he happened to be riding the same direction on completely legitimate law enforcement business that had nothing whatsoever to do with curiosity. He watched her from a distance for a while, not intrusively but attentively, the way a man watches something that doesn't fit into any category he already has. She dismounted at the base of a rocky outcropping with the ease of someone who had been in the saddle for years, tied her horse with a practiced hand, and began examining the rock face with a focused intensity that reminded him more of a scientist than a schoolteacher. She had a compass in one hand and a small notebook in the other, and she moved along the outcropping's base with a deliberate, systematic attention that suggested she was not exploring randomly. She was looking for something specific. He told himself he would not ask about it. He asked about it the following week when they crossed paths at the post office. "What were you looking for out on the eastern ridge last Saturday?" He said without preamble because he had discovered that preamble was generally wasted on Abigail Winslow. She looked at him with that particular expression she wore when she was deciding how much information the situation warranted. "Geological formation," she said. "Are you a geologist?" "I'm a teacher," she said, "but I've done cartographic work in these mountains before. I find it useful to have accurate maps." He stared at her. "You've surveyed the San Jacintos." "Parts of them," she said, with a composure that suggested the achievement was merely factual rather than remarkable. I worked for the Denver and Rio Grande survey team in the summers of 1879, 1880, and 1881. The eastern approaches to the range specifically. The railroad considered a route through Rattlesnake Ridge before they decided on the southern alignment. He had ridden Rattlesnake Ridge more times than he could count. He thought he knew it as well as any man alive. He was learning that his assumption needed revision. Their relationship in those first weeks was one of careful, slightly combative mutual respect, like two chess players who haven't quite committed to their opening strategy. They were thrown together by the rhythms of small-town life, the church social, the town meetings, the occasional shared dinner at the Garrett boarding house where they both ate, and in each of these encounters there was a tension between them that Abigail analyzed with academic rigor and refused to name, and Stephen responded to by becoming, when she was nearby, slightly more formal and slightly more irritable than was strictly necessary. The town noticed. Towns of 400 always notice. Margaret Tully at the post office had opinions about it. Mrs. Garrett at the boarding house had opinions about it. Even Sheriff Cord Haynes, Stephen's boss, who was a man of few words and fewer opinions about anything that didn't directly affect law enforcement, mentioned once, over a shared cup of coffee in the sheriff's office, that the new schoolteacher seemed to be taking up a notable amount of space in the deputy's awareness. "She's a complication," Stephen said, because that was the most honest word he had for it. "Seems capable," Cord observed. "Too capable," Stephen said, and then immediately recognized that he'd said something revealing and was grateful that Cord Haynes did not pursue it. The thing was, he respected capability. He respected it in other deputies, in sheriffs, in ranchers, in anyone who operated in this landscape, where competence was literally the difference between life and death. But something about Abigail Winslow's competence unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite categorize, and he had been a careful enough observer of himself over 32 years to know that unsettlement of that particular quality was a signal worth paying attention to. He just wasn't sure what it was signaling yet. October passed into November with the first serious cold front rolling down from the mountains, and the children of Callow arrived at the schoolhouse in heavier coats, and Abigail kept her stove burning hot and read them Robert Louis Stevenson, and showed them on her floor maps exactly where Scotland was in relation to Colorado, which opened a conversation about oceans and distance that kept the room electric with questions for an entire afternoon. She wrote to a book distributor in Denver and arranged for a shipment of additional volumes, paying for some of them out of her own salary because the council's education budget was, in her considered assessment, an embarrassment. In November, the Duchamp trouble started. Clara Duchamp was 11 years old, nearly 12, and she was one of Abigail's most gifted students, a girl with an incandescent curiosity and a mathematical mind that could have taken her anywhere if the world were arranged to let women go anywhere they wished. She lived with her grandfather Emmett on a small cattle ranch 8 miles east of town, and she rode to school on a steady old roan that Emmett trusted completely. In the second week of November, Clara did not appear at school on Monday morning, or Tuesday. On Wednesday, Abigail rode out to the Duchamp ranch after school and found Emmett Duchamp in a state of barely controlled terror, sitting at Clara's bedside while the girl burned with a fever that had come on suddenly over the weekend. He had sent for the local physician, the one who operated out of an office above the hardware store, and that man had done what he could but had admitted, with the honesty of a person who knows his own limits, that the infection had features he did not recognize, and that the only doctor in the region with the specific knowledge and medicine required was Dr. Aloysius Hensley in Silver Creek, 40 miles away on the other side of the San Jacinto Range. 40 miles was nothing. In summer, on clear roads. In November, with the mountain passes unpredictable and the weather already showing its teeth, 40 miles through the San Jacintos was a serious undertaking, and Clara was getting worse by the day. Abigail sat with Clara for an hour that Wednesday evening, talking quietly to her when she was coherent and simply holding her hand when she was not. And she made a private, absolute decision on the way back to Callow that she was not going to let this child die because a mountain was inconvenient. She went to the sheriff's office the following morning. Stephen was alone when she came in, sitting at his desk with a stack of wanted circulars that he was supposed to be filing and was instead using as a surface for his coffee cup, and he looked up when she entered with the particular expression he reserved for her presence, which was something between alertness and defensive preparation. She explained the situation in clear, direct terms. Clara Duchamp was seriously ill. She needed Dr. Hensley in Silver Creek. The route through Rattlesnake Ridge was the fastest path through the mountains. She needed someone who knew the trail to guide the wagon, and Emmett Duchamp was 63 years old and in no condition to navigate a mountain pass alone in November weather. "I'll take them," Stephen said before she had finished explaining, because whatever else Stephen Fletcher was, he was not the kind of man who heard about a sick child and looked for reasons not to act. "I'm coming with you," Abigail said. He did look for reasons to refuse that. She could see him assembling them: the weather, the terrain, the unsuitable nature of the journey for a woman, and she watched each of them get discarded as he processed that she was looking at him with an expression that suggested she would simply follow along behind if he said no. "Can you ride hard if you have to?" he said. "I ride well enough," she said, which was the most modest thing she had ever said in her life, because she had been riding since she was 8 years old and had covered more mountain terrain on horseback than most men twice her age. He nodded. "We leave at first light Friday. Talk to Emmett. The wagon needs to be prepared." They rode out on that Friday morning in December. Not yet the crisis of January, but a preliminary journey to assess the situation, and that ride established patterns between them that the later journey would push to their breaking point and beyond. Emmett drove the wagon with Clara bundled inside it in every blanket the Duchamp ranch possessed. Stephen rode his gray gelding, a powerful, sure-footed animal named Colt that had seen every kind of mountain terrain. Abigail rode her bay mare, whom she called Meridian, a name she had given her because of the way the horse moved along a compass line with undeviating precision. They made it through Rattlesnake Ridge that December day without incident. The trail was passable barely, with ice on the switchbacks and a wind that came down off the upper peaks with aggressive persistence, but they navigated it, and Clara arrived in Silver Creek, where Dr. Hensley confirmed the diagnosis and began treatment. And within a week, the girl was well enough to travel home with a supply of the necessary medication. Abigail rode the return journey beside Stephen on a clear, cold December afternoon, and for the first time since they'd met, they talked without the slight current of tension that usually characterized their exchanges. Perhaps it was the relief of Clara's recovery. Perhaps it was the particular beauty of the mountains in winter light, the peaks catching the low sun at angles that made them look painted rather than real. Perhaps it was simply that they had shared a hard thing together and survived it. He told her about his 8 years in Callow. He'd come west from Missouri at 24, following no particular plan beyond the conviction that the frontier was where a man found out what he was actually made of, and had discovered that what he was made of apparently included a talent for law enforcement and an attachment to these specific mountains that had never loosened its grip on him. He'd taken the deputy's position under Sheriff Haynes 3 years after arriving and had not looked seriously at leaving since. She told him about Philadelphia, about the normal school, about the quiet suffocation of teaching girls nothing but the decorative arts, and about the railroad survey work that had given her 3 summers of exactly the kind of freedom she'd been craving. She described the mountains the way you describe something you've measured and loved simultaneously, with a precision and a reverence that were not in contradiction. He listened to her in a way she was not accustomed to, not waiting for a pause to offer his own opinion, not redirecting towards something more comfortable, but actually listening, the kind of listening that required the whole of a person's attention, and she found herself saying things she hadn't planned to say, things about wanting to matter in a place where mattering was possible, about the specific loneliness of being genuinely capable in a context that only wanted you to be decorative. "Callow needs capable," he said simply. "Callow needs a schoolteacher," she corrected. "Same thing," he said, and she looked at him sideways, and the look that passed between them on that mountain road in December was the first one between them that did not have armor in it. But then they were back in town, and the armor went back on because whatever that look had been, it was something that neither of them had the language for yet, and the space between a deputy and the schoolteacher in a town of 400 people was a space full of observation, and neither of them was ready for that particular kind of scrutiny. December passed. Clara Duchamp recovered fully and returned to school in the third week of the month, bringing Abigail a jar of her grandfather's honey as a gift that contained more emotion than Emmett Duchamp would ever articulate with words. The children performed a Christmas reading that Abigail had organized, and the entire town came, and she sat in the back of the schoolroom afterward while parents collected their children and felt something she could only call rightness about where she was. Stephen stood in the doorway during that performance with his arms crossed, watching, and when he caught her eye across the crowded room and gave her the kind of slow, acknowledging nod that is not casual at all, she felt the warmth of it in her chest for longer than was strictly appropriate. January came down out of the mountains like something that had made a decision. The first week brought temperatures that dropped to 20 below at night and barely climbed above zero in the afternoons, and a wind that found every gap in every building and made itself comfortable. The second week brought 6 inches of snow that turned the streets of Callow to churned mud when the afternoon briefly warmed above freezing, and to treacherous ice when it didn't. On the 15th of January, Clara Duchamp's medication ran out. Emmett Duchamp rode into town in a state of barely suppressed panic, because he had assumed there was more of the medication and had discovered his assumption was wrong, and Clara had begun showing the early warning signs that Dr. Hensley had specified were indicators of relapse. She needed more of the specific compound within 3 days. 3 days. Silver Creek, 40 miles through the San Jacintos in January. Stephen heard about it at the sheriff's office and was already pulling on his heaviest coat when Abigail arrived, having heard about it from Mrs. Garrett, who had heard about it from the pharmacist's wife, who had heard about it from Emmett himself. "I'm going," Stephen said. "We're going," Abigail said. He opened his mouth and she met his gaze with a steadiness that closed it again. Because he had ridden with her in December, and he knew, now, the quality of her horsemanship, knew that she would not slow him down and might in fact be more useful than any other person in Callow he could have taken with him. And because there was something else, something that he still refused to fully name, that made the idea of leaving her behind feel like a deprivation he wasn't ready to accept. "Emmett comes with the wagon," he said. "Same as before." "Same as before," she agreed. They left before dawn on the 16th of January, 1883, in weather that was, in the opinion of every experienced mountain person in Callow, deeply inadvisable for long travel. The temperature was well below zero. The sky was the particular gray that meant more snow. The wind was moving in off the upper peaks with a sustained, bitter authority that made every breath a small act of will. They reached the base of Rattlesnake Ridge as the light was fully up, and that was when Stephen rode ahead to assess the trail and came back with the news that confirmed what the gray sky had been suggesting. The upper face had come down in last night's avalanche. The trail was sealed. He stood at the base of the blocked trail, the wind driving snow into his face, and he told them what he saw, and what he saw was the end of a plan. The end of the route he knew. The end of his authority in this particular situation, though he did not frame it to himself in those words. And Abigail said, "What about the eastern face, above the timberline?" He told her there was no trail above the timberline. She reached into her saddlebag. He watched her extract a folded piece of oilcloth, weather-sealed and worn at the creases from long use, and she unfolded it across Meridian's neck with hands that moved with practiced confidence despite the gloves she wore against the cold. It was a map. Not a printed map, not anything from a publisher or a surveying office, but a hand-drawn map of extraordinary detail, rendered in ink so fine and with such cartographic precision that it would have been recognizable as professional work by anyone who knew what professional survey work looked like. The San Jacinto Eastern Range. Every slope, every drainage, every geological formation she had documented in 3 summers of systematic walking. And there, above the timberline on the eastern face, penciled in with the notation seasonal game path, dry season only, width approximately 4 feet, exposed but passable, was a line he had never seen on any map. A line that traversed the eastern face at an elevation that bypassed the avalanche-prone upper slopes entirely, that connected to a descent route on the far side that joined the Silver Creek road approximately 6 miles from town. He stared at it. He looked up at the mountain, recalibrating everything he thought he knew about it against the reality she was showing him. "You mapped this," he said. His voice came out strange, like a man who has just discovered a room in a house he thought he knew completely. "In the summer of 1880, she said. "A Ute elder named Nakona showed it to me the first time. I documented it because the railroad needed every possible route option. The path appears in no official records because the survey team had already committed to the southern route by the time I reported it." "A Ute trail," he said. "A path that has been used for probably 1,000 years, she said, with the careful precision she used when correcting a misperception without making it a confrontation. It avoids the avalanche slopes because the people who created it understood which slopes were dangerous. It's exposed at the top, which is why it's inadvisable in the worst winter conditions. But today's wind is from the west, which means the eastern face has somewhat less accumulation. If we move carefully and quickly, we can get across before the next front builds." She was reading the mountain. She was reading it from knowledge and from direct observation simultaneously, her eyes moving between the map and the sky and the terrain with a fluency that he recognized as the product of genuine expertise. Not guesswork, not optimism, calculated assessment. He had been doing law enforcement in this valley for 8 years, and the moment he recognized that he was looking at someone who simply knew more than he did about the specific thing that was currently the most important thing, he felt the armature of his certainty shift in a way he had not expected. He was not, he discovered, threatened by it. He was astonished by it. And underneath the astonishment was something else. Something warm and profound that moved through him like sunlight finding a gap in winter clouds, which was the beginning of a love he had been slowly building without quite realizing it, now recognizing itself in the presence of her competence and her knowledge, and the absolute, unsentimental confidence with which she offered the solution he had told her didn't exist. "Lead the way," he said. She blinked. A small reaction, quickly controlled, but he caught it. The brief surprise of a woman who had been prepared to argue for permission and did not need to. "All right," she said. "Emmett, you'll need to unhitch 1 horse from the wagon. The wagon itself can't make the path, but the horse can carry Clara in a blanket sling if we construct one. I've seen it done." Emmett Duchamp, who had spent 63 years in country where you trusted whoever knew the way, nodded without hesitation. They spent 20 minutes constructing a blanket sling that would carry Clara supported between Emmett's horse and Meridian, a system that Abigail designed with engineering precision and explained to both Stephen and Emmett with the calm clarity of a teacher who was accustomed to making complex things comprehensible. Stephen worked beside her in silence, following her specifications exactly, watching her hands move with assurance, and the physical proximity of working together in the cold had a quality that he registered in a part of himself that was not concerned with maps or trails or sick children. Then they started up the eastern face. The path was there. He kept expecting it not to be, kept expecting to reach a point where the map's confidence exceeded the mountain's reality. But it was there, exactly where she had drawn it, barely 4 feet wide in places, exposed to the west wind in a way that required them to angle their horses carefully, but solid underfoot and navigable with the care she directed. She rode at the front. He rode behind, watching the path over her shoulder and watching her simultaneously, the way she read the terrain, the small adjustments she made to Meridian's direction with her knees and her hands, the way she checked back every few minutes to confirm that the sling between the 2 horses was secure. The wind was bitter at this elevation, and his face was numb, and the sky to the northwest had taken on a color that meant serious weather coming, and Abigail Winslow was threading them through the San Jacinto Range on a path that his 8 years of local knowledge had never shown him. He was, without reservation, in awe. The traverse took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of focused, careful, sometimes frightening passage along the eastern face, with the mountain dropping away to the south in a long sweep of snow-covered slope that was beautiful and lethal in equal proportion. And at the end of it, they descended through a stand of winter-bare aspens onto a familiar road that he recognized as the Silver Creek approach. And Abigail pulled Meridian up and looked back at him with an expression of practical satisfaction that was the most honest thing he had ever seen on anyone's face. 6 miles to Dr. Hensley, she said. 6 miles to Dr. Hensley, he confirmed. He wanted to say something more, something equal to the magnitude of what she had just done. But the wind was picking up and Clara needed the doctor, and there was no time for anything that wasn't movement. So he simply rode up beside her, and for a moment their horses were shoulder to shoulder on the mountain road, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything. But the thing between them that had been building since September completed some critical stage of its construction in that silent exchange. They reached Silver Creek in an hour and a half. Dr. Hensley received them with the efficient urgency of a professional who understood the stakes, examined Clara, confirmed the early relapse indicators, and supplied the medication with the instruction that she should begin it immediately, which she did, there in his examining room, while Emmett sat beside her holding her hand with an expression of such fierce, quiet love that Abigail had to look away for a moment. Stephen found her standing outside the doctor's office on the Silver Creek Main Street, looking up at the mountains that loomed above the town, the western faces dark with the incoming front that had been building all day. He came to stand beside her close enough that the warmth of him was present even through the cold. "How long have you known about that path?" he said. "Since 1880, she said, "but I didn't know we would need it until this morning. You could have told me about it earlier." "I mentioned the eastern face," she said. "You told me there was no trail." He was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong." "Yes," she said, without cruelty, simply as fact. "You were working from an incomplete map. And you had the complete one all along." She looked at him. "I've been carrying complete maps of these mountains since I arrived in Callow," she said. "I didn't know anyone needed them." He turned his head to look at her, and the quality of his gaze was different from anything he had directed at her before. All the defensive alertness was gone, all the preparatory wariness. What remained was direct and unguarded, and it was a great deal more than she had expected to see, and she felt the impact of it like a change in atmospheric pressure, something that altered the environment without warning. "I owe you a considerable apology," he said, "for underestimating what you know." "You can owe it to me on the ride back," she said, because she was not, even in a moment of emotional significance, willing to become sentimental when Clara Duchamp's medication schedule was still a logistical concern. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face so completely that she made an immediate private note to herself that she intended to see it again. They stayed in Silver Creek that night. The weather front arrived in full force around sunset, burying the town in 4 inches of new snow, and eliminating any possibility of travel until morning, which meant 4 people in a town where they knew no one, trying to secure lodging on short notice. The Silver Creek Hotel had 2 rooms available. Emmett and Clara took one, wrapped in blankets and the particular relief of a crisis that had been survived. Stephen got the key to the other and held it for a moment and then looked at Abigail. "I'll sleep in the stable with the horses," he said, with a matter-of-fact practicality that was completely characteristic of him. "You take the room." She looked at the key in his hand and then at him. "That is extremely unnecessary. It's appropriate," he said. "You take the room." She took the room. But she lay awake for a long time in the narrow hotel bed, listening to the snow fall against the window, and thinking about a man who would give up the only available shelter on a January night in the mountains as a matter of basic courtesy, and what that said about him, and what the expression on his face on the Silver Creek street had meant, and whether she had any business being as stirred by any of it as she clearly was. The morning broke clear and ferociously cold, the kind of cold that comes after a storm when the sky is scoured clean and everything has a crystalline, absolute quality. Abigail was up before dawn, checking on Meridian in the stable, and she found Stephen already there, awake and apparently not particularly the worse for his night on a pile of hay, his hands around a tin cup of something hot that the stable master had provided. He looked up when she came in and handed her the cup without asking whether she wanted it, which was the first spontaneously generous gesture he had made toward her that wasn't prompted by necessity. She drank from it. Coffee. Strong enough to remove paint from a barn door. Perfect. "The Ute elder," he said without preamble. "Nakona, you said he showed you the path." "In 1880, she said. "We were surveying the eastern approach, and I had gotten ahead of the main group, which the survey team leader strongly disapproved of but which produced the most accurate results. I encountered Nakona near the upper Aspen Grove. He was wary at first, but I had a phrase book and some patience, and eventually he seemed to understand that I was mapping the terrain, not marking it for settlement. And he showed you the path." "He showed me many things," she said. "He knew these mountains the way you know the streets of Callow. He had names for formations that no English map has ever recorded. I documented what I could, and I have always regretted that I could document so little." She paused. "When we get back, you should know that the Ute communities in these mountains have been systematically displaced from their traditional ranges over the past several years. Some of the paths I mapped may eventually be inaccessible, because the people who maintain knowledge of them have been forced to other territory." He was quiet for a moment. It was the particular quality of quiet he had when he was genuinely thinking rather than simply waiting. "I know," he said. "It's wrong." She looked at him with some surprise. "I'm a lawman," he said, "not a politician. I enforce the laws I'm given. It doesn't mean I think all of them are just." He looked at his coffee. "There are things about how we've come to be here that I think about more than I used to." It was, she thought, the most honest thing he had said to her, and honesty, she had decided long ago, was the quality she valued above all others in a person, because honesty was the foundation of everything else that mattered. They returned to Callow on the clear, cold morning of January 17th, via the same eastern-face path, which in the morning light and with the wind settled, was navigable without the anxiety of the previous day. Emmett drove the remounted wagon with Clara beside him, the girl already responding to the medication with the resilient speed of the young. Stephen rode Colt and Abigail rode Meridian, and they traveled side by side on the stretches of road where the width permitted it, and the conversation between them had changed. The vocabulary was the same, but the underlying grammar was different, easier, more direct, with the occasional space of comfortable silence that is the true test of whether two people can be together. They reached Callow by early afternoon. The town appeared below them as they came off the mountain road, smoke rising from chimneys, the main street visible in miniature, and the particular sensation of arriving somewhere you belong, which is not the same as arriving somewhere familiar, washed over Abigail with enough force that she had to take a breath. She belonged here. She had known it at some level since September, but the mountains had confirmed it, the way mountains always confirm things, by subjecting them to conditions that reveal which things are real. She was aware of Stephen riding beside her. She was aware of him with a precision that she recognized as the kind of awareness that doesn't resolve itself into neutrality if you ignore it. It accumulates. And she was not, at 27, so committed to independence that she had failed to recognize that independence and love are not in competition. They have never been in competition. The argument that they are is made by people who require a particular kind of compliance from the people they love. And Stephen Fletcher, she had observed with increasing certainty, was not that kind of person. He was the kind of person who said lead the way when he was lost and meant it. Who gave up the only warm room on a January night not as a gesture of condescension, but as a genuine act of care. Who listened when she spoke about the Ute people and the maps and the injustice of displacement not with polite tolerance, but with a moral seriousness that engaged the issue rather than deflecting it. He was the kind of person who had told her she was wrong exactly once in 4 months, and had said he was wrong in return without requiring the universe to collapse first. She acknowledged to herself on the descent into Callow, in a considerable amount of trouble, because she was not the kind of woman who could love by halves. Emmett Duchamp's wagon reached the far end of Main Street, and he raised a hand in farewell, and turned east toward his ranch, and Stephen and Abigail both watched him go for a moment before turning toward the livery. They unsaddled their horses in companionable silence, working on opposite sides of the stable aisle with the easy coordination of people who have navigated a mountain together and calibrated their movements accordingly. When the horses were settled, Abigail gathered her saddlebag, the one with the oilcloth maps, and slung it over her shoulder. "Miss Winslow," Stephen said. She turned. He was standing in the stable doorway with the winter light behind him, and he looked like the kind of painting you see in museum vestibules and remember afterward without being able to explain why. "I would like to take you to dinner," he said, "at the Garrett house, tonight if that's agreeable." She considered him for a moment. Not the offer, the man, the full context of everything she had observed and understood about him in 4 months of careful attention. "That would be agreeable," she said. Dinner at the Garrett boarding house was not, in itself, a notable social occasion. Everyone in Callow ate there when they didn't cook for themselves, and the presence of the deputy and the schoolteacher at the same table was not unprecedented. But there was a quality to it that evening, a deliberateness to his attention and a corresponding deliberateness to hers, that Mrs. Garrett, who was observant in the way that people who run boarding houses must be, registered immediately and catalogued for future reference with great satisfaction. They talked through dinner and afterward in the sitting room for 2 hours, not about anything world historical. About books, because Abigail had brought a copy of a Mark Twain novel from Denver and Stephen had opinions about it that were more nuanced than she had expected. About the spring planting plans that affected the whole valley, because the quality of the growing season was as much a law enforcement concern as anything else in a community where food security was not abstract. About the stars, which were extraordinary tonight above the snow-covered valley, visible through the sitting room window in the particular clarity of a post-storm January sky. He walked her to the foot of the boarding house stairs at the end of the evening, which was the natural stopping point, and stood with his hat in his hands in a posture she had never seen from him before, the slightly uncertain posture of a man who is navigating unfamiliar terrain with the same focused attention he would give to an unfamiliar mountain. "I've been managing my awareness of you very poorly," he said, with such direct, self-aware honesty that she was briefly struck silent. "For several months." "I know," she said. "You know. You became formal in my presence in a very specific way," she said. "It's a recognizable pattern." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him deciding whether to be embarrassed by this and arriving at the correct conclusion that embarrassment was not productive. "What would you suggest I do differently?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think. "Stop managing it," she said. "It doesn't improve with management." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was accepting information rather than merely hearing it. "All right," he said. "Good night, Miss Winslow." "Good night, Deputy Fletcher." She was halfway up the stairs when he said, "Abigail." She stopped. "Would it be an imposition," he said carefully, "if I called you Abigail?" She turned to look back at him from the third step, which put her approximately at his eye level, and the proximity was something she noted with her whole nervous system. "Stephen," she said, and watched him absorb the change. "Good night," he said again. Not Miss Winslow, just the word itself, full of something new. "Good night," she said. February in Callow was the month that stripped everything down to essentials, and what remained of the distance between them in February was not much. He took to walking her home from the schoolhouse on evenings when his patrol route put him on that side of town, which, she noted with a private amusement, it did with increasing frequency. She showed him her full set of survey maps one evening at the boarding house sitting room table, spreading them out and walking him through the geography she had documented, and he bent over the maps with a genuine, focused attention that was one of the things she was learning to love about him. This capacity for complete engagement with whatever was in front of him. He had a dark past with the subject of incomplete knowledge. He told her about it in pieces, over several evenings, the way you disclose things that still hurt. A deputy before him in Callow, a man named Harker, had been killed during a confrontation with a group of cattle rustlers 8 miles east of town in the summer of 1878, 2 years before Stephen arrived. Harker had gone in without adequate information about the terrain, had been outmaneuvered, and had died in a canyon because he didn't know there was a second exit. Stephen had studied the incident report when he came to Callow, had studied it with the intensity of someone trying to prevent a tragedy from repeating, and had developed his knowledge of the local geography with the kind of driven thoroughness that was, she recognized, a form of tribute to a man he had never met. "You've been trying to know everything about this terrain," she said, on an evening in mid-February with snow padding quietly against the window. "Yes," he said, "and then I arrived with a map that showed you something you'd missed." He looked at her steadily. "Yes, that must have been alarming." "Alarming isn't quite the word," he said, clarifying maybe. "I realized I'd been confusing thoroughness with completeness. Harker had been thorough. He'd done everything he knew to do, he just didn't know enough." He paused. "I was in danger of making the same mistake differently. Thinking that because I'd worked hard at knowing the terrain, I actually knew all of it." "No one knows all of anything," she said. "You come fairly close with these mountains." "I know the eastern approaches in summer conditions," she said, with the precision that was her dominant mode. "I know the geology extensively. I know the documented trail system thoroughly. There are areas I've never surveyed, routes I don't know, faces I've never walked. The mountain is always more than the map." He was looking at her with that direct, unguarded expression she had seen on the Silver Creek street, and had been seeing with increasing frequency since. And she felt it the way you feel a change in the air before weather comes, as a physical alteration in the quality of the present moment. "Abigail," he said. "Stephen," she said, which was her way of indicating she was listening with all of herself rather than just the surface. "I would like to court you," he said, "formally, properly, with whatever passes for propriety in a cattle town in January, which is not very much, but with all the intention that should accompany the word." She looked at him across the survey map spread between them on the table, the mountains rendered in her precise ink lines, the trails she had walked and the paths she had found, and the one unmarked trail that had changed everything. "I would like that," she said. The courtship of Abigail Winslow and Stephen Fletcher in the winter and spring of 1883 became one of those things in Callow that people referenced later as simply obvious. The way the conclusion of a well-constructed argument feels obvious once you've followed all the steps. Margaret Tully at the post office said she had seen it coming since October. Mrs. Garrett said since the first night Abigail came to dinner. Sheriff Cord Haynes said nothing, but he arrived at work 2 days after February 14th with a slightly improved disposition that may or may not have been connected to the fact that Stephen had been whistling in the office, which was unprecedented. They were a study in complementary competencies. She knew the mountains from their geology outward. He knew the valley and its people with the same deep familiarity. She could read a topographical map the way a musician reads a score. He could read a room full of people, their loyalties and their fears and their hidden motives, with the same instinctive fluency. She brought precision and system to problems. He brought the kind of intuitive, rapid assessment that came from years of making consequential decisions on insufficient information. They argued sometimes about methods and about principles, occasionally about each other's blind spots, which they had both identified with characteristic thoroughness. He had a tendency toward decisive action that occasionally outpaced adequate information. She had a tendency toward comprehensive assessment that occasionally delayed action past the optimal moment. They told each other this directly, in the way that people who are genuinely compatible tell each other difficult truths, and in doing so they began to correct for each other's limitations rather than being compounded by them. In March, he brought her a book from the General Store's limited selection, a geological survey publication from the Colorado Territorial Survey, because he had overheard her mention that she didn't have access to it and had sent away for it without telling her, and the expression on her face when he handed it to her was one she was not able to fully control, and he saw all of it, the delight and the surprise and the warmth beneath both. And he felt the thing in his chest that had been building since the first day she walked into the schoolhouse tighten into something so clear and specific that it left no room for the words he'd been using to approximate it. He loved her. It was not complicated, and it was not ambiguous, and it was not going to resolve itself into anything else. In April, as the snow retreated up the mountain slopes and the valley turned tentatively green, Clara Dutchamp came back to school fully recovered and fully restored to the incandescent, relentless curiosity that made her such a remarkable student. She attached herself to Abigail with the loyalty of someone who understands, at 11 going on 12, that they have been given something beyond the ordinary, and Abigail accepted that attachment with a warmth that had none of the professional distance that lesser teachers would have maintained. Clara also, with the perceptive accuracy of a child who has grown up observing adults carefully in the absence of her parents, both of whom had died when she was 4, looked at Abigail and then at Stephen when they were in the same space and said, with the directness that was her most characteristic quality, "You should just tell each other." Abigail, who was shelving books at the time, did not visibly react. Stephen, who was repairing the schoolhouse stovepipe, because the damper plate had finally given out entirely, turned from the stovepipe and regarded Clara with a look that was half amusement and half something more complex. "Tell each other what?" he asked. Clara gave him the expression that children reserve for adults who are being deliberately obtuse. "The obvious thing," she said, and returned to her reading with the satisfaction of someone who has done what was necessary. Stephen looked at Abigail. Abigail finished shelving the book she was holding and turned around. "She's not wrong," she said. "She's 11, he said. "She's exceptionally perceptive," Abigail said, "and she's right. We've been very careful and very patient and very appropriate, and I would like to suggest that we have perhaps been all of those things in sufficient quantity." He set down his tools and crossed the schoolroom. The late afternoon light came in through the west windows and lit the dust motes floating between them and turned the room amber and gold. He stopped in front of her and she looked up at him, and all the maps she had ever drawn, all the trails she had ever walked, all the careful and precise documentation of everything she had ever encountered in these mountains, led here, to this room, to this man, to this exact quality of attention with which he was looking at her now. "Abigail," he said, "I love you. I've been working up to saying it plainly since January, and I've decided that working up to it is simply a waste of time we could be spending better." "I love you," she said, with the same directness, because she was constitutionally incapable of being less than exact about important things. "I have been aware of it since the mountain road in December, which I believe was before you were fully aware of it yourself." "Probably fair," he said, and something in his face went easy and open in a way she had not seen before and understood immediately was rare. "Can I kiss you?" "Yes," she said. "And Clara has slipped out the back door, so we have the schoolroom to ourselves, which suggests she planned this." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, without restraint, and it was the best sound she had heard in Callow, or possibly anywhere. Then he cupped her face in his hands with a gentleness that was the precise opposite of the calloused practicality of those hands at all other times, and he kissed her. And the San Jacinto Mountains stood above the valley in the April light as they had stood for 10,000 years, knowing nothing about human love affairs and caring less, and it was perfect. The engagement was not a surprise to anyone in Callow. Stephen asked Abigail formally on the first Saturday in May, in the foothills below the mountains on the eastern ridge where she liked to ride, on a morning so clear and bright that the world had the quality of something new made. He had consulted no one about the ring, which he had ordered from Denver, and which was a simple gold band with a small garnet stone that he had chosen, because garnets were deep red, and the color suited her, which was a more romantic consideration than he would have admitted publicly. She said yes before he had finished the question, which he later told Sheriff Haynes had been both gratifying and slightly funny, and Haynes had nodded in a way that suggested he found the whole thing satisfying rather than amusing. They were married in June of 1883, in the Callow church, in a ceremony that the whole town attended because the whole town had been watching this particular development with proprietary interest for months. Abigail wore a dress she had made herself, practical ivory wool because she was who she was, and carried a spray of wild columbines from the mountain meadows because she had collected them herself on a Friday morning ride, and she preferred flowers she had found to flowers she had been given. Clara Dutchamp sat in the front pew with Emmett beside her and cried in the direct, unself-conscious way that children cry when they are genuinely moved, and Emmett kept his eyes very carefully forward throughout the ceremony, and only once brought his weathered hand up to his weathered face in a gesture that was not, if you were being precise about it, wiping a tear. They settled into a house on the western edge of Callow that had been empty for a year and needed everything doing to it, which suited them both, because they were people who believed in making the places they inhabited properly functional rather than simply adequate. Abigail made a study of the second bedroom and lined it with shelves, and filled the shelves with her maps and her survey publications and her geological specimens, and the books that had been accumulating since Philadelphia. And the room had the quality of a mind made physical. And Stephen stood in the doorway of it one evening in early July, and felt an emotion he didn't have a word for, which was something like the privilege of witnessing something rare. She taught school through the following autumn and spring with the same fierce, joyful intensity that had characterized her first year, adding to her curriculum a course in basic cartography for the older students that generated astonishment in the town council and genuine enthusiasm among the students, several of whom had never thought of maps as anything but objects you purchased rather than things you made through knowledge and careful observation. In the autumn of 1884, Abigail became pregnant with their first child, a development that she managed with characteristic pragmatism, continuing to teach through December of that year and arranging for a substitute, the pastor's wife who had some teaching experience, to cover the spring term. Stephen managed the news with an expression that Abigail documented privately as the most openly unguarded emotion she had ever seen from him, a combination of joy and terror, and something vast that he couldn't quite house in his face, and she found all three parts of it equally endearing. Their son was born in May of 1885, on a spring morning with the mountains visible from the bedroom window in the particular clarity of a day after rain. Stephen delivered him himself, with Dr. Mercer from the general practice that had opened that winter, and it was an event that reorganized every priority Stephen had ever held in a matter of minutes and left him, afterward, sitting with his son's infinitesimal weight in his arms in a state of such complete and undefended wonder that Abigail, who was exhausted and incandescent simultaneously, looked at the two of them together and felt the full weight of everything she had built here in this mountain valley settle around her like something permanent. They named him Thomas Nakona Fletcher. Thomas for his paternal grandfather, who had died when Stephen was 19, and whose memory Stephen carried as a standard he tried to live up to. Nakona for the Ute elder who had shown Abigail the trail through the mountains that had been, in its way, the beginning of everything. Stephen had suggested the second name himself, one evening months before the birth, when they had been talking about the Ute displacement policies and the specific injustice of a knowledge system being systematically erased along with the communities that held it. He could not change the law. He was not a politician, as he had told her, only a lawman. But he could honor the knowledge and the person who had shared it, in the only permanent way available to him in 1885, which was in the name of his son. Abigail had looked at him when he suggested it, and loved him with a fullness that had no adequate words in English or any other language she had studied, and said yes. Thomas Nakona Fletcher grew up between the mountains and the valley with the freedom that the frontier offered children of that era, which was considerable and not without danger, but with the specific advantage of a mother who knew every rock face and drainage and game trail in the San Jacinto Range, and a father who knew every person in the valley and their character, and would be immediately informed by 6 different sources if anything happened to anyone he cared about. Clara Duchamp, who grew up into a young woman of formidable mathematical gifts and became one of Abigail's most devoted intellectual correspondents, later in life credited the morning of the Unmarked trail with every subsequent good thing that had happened in the lives of everyone involved in it. She was not given to sentiment, but she was given to accurate accounting, and her accounting was this. A blocked path had forced an alternate route, and the alternate route had been found by the person who had prepared for exactly that contingency, and the finding of it had demonstrated something to a man who needed the demonstration, and the demonstration had cleared the last obstacle between them, and in the clearing of it, everything that followed had become possible. The mountains did not care about any of this. The San Jacinto Range stood above the valley in every season with the magnificent indifference of geology to human chronology. But the trail was there, the unmarked trail that Nakona had walked for years before Abigail documented it, and Abigail had walked for years before Stephen Fletcher was finally shown it. And it was there every January when the other paths were closed, every December when the weather turned severe, every November when the valley below needed something that could only be reached by going over the mountain rather than around it. In the spring of 1887, Abigail presented the full set of her San Jacinto survey maps to the Callow Town Council, properly mounted and annotated, with a proposal that the town maintain official knowledge of the alternate routes they depicted, because the consequences of being caught without that knowledge in an emergency were a matter of documented historical record. The council accepted the maps and the proposal. The maps were framed and hung in the sheriff's office, where they occupied a wall that Stephen passed every working day. He had privately added a notation to the map that showed the eastern face path, below Abigail's original penciled description of the trail. January 16, 1883. Navigated in emergency conditions, trail adequate for the purpose, Map accurate in all particulars. S. Fletcher, Deputy. He had done it without telling her, and she had found it one afternoon when she visited the office, and she had stood in front of the map for a long moment reading the notation, and when she turned around he was watching her from his desk with that expression she knew as specifically his, equal parts directness and warmth, and the particular quality of attention he gave to things he valued most. Accurate in all particulars, she said. It is, he said. You should know that I've never questioned it. She sat down across from him at his desk, in the chair reserved for visitors of the law enforcement kind, and looked at him across the surface between them. She was carrying their second child, 7 months along, and the fact of that was visible and vivid and ordinary simultaneously in the way that the facts of a life, once they accumulate, become part of the landscape rather than events within it. I have something to tell you, she said. Good something or complicated something. I believe it's good, she said, but I'm presenting it as information first and let you make your own assessment. He waited. I've had a letter from the Colorado Territorial Survey, she said. They want to commission a formal survey of the San Jacinto eastern approaches, using my existing maps as a foundation. They're asking if I would lead the project. He was very still for a moment. A surveying project. A paid surveying project, she said. The compensation is substantial. The work would begin in June after the baby and run through August. I would need to be in the field for portions of that period. He thought about it. She watched him think about it, which was one of the things she had spent 4 years learning to read, the particular quality of his thought when he was being thorough rather than reactive, and what she saw was not hesitation about her capability or appropriateness for the work. What she saw was a man thinking through logistics, childcare, seasonal staffing at the sheriff's office, how to make the space for what she needed to do. Can we bring Thomas? He said. She blinked. He would be 2 years old. He survived being named partly for a Ute elder by a deputy who was learning to be broader-minded, Stephen said. I think he can manage a summer in the San Jacintos. She laughed. She laughed with the full, unguarded joy that had been one of the things he had worked hardest to produce in her in 4 years, because the sound of it was one of his favorite things in the world. We can bring Thomas, she said. Then say yes to the survey, he said. You've been wanting to finish what you started. Say yes. She wrote back to the Territorial Survey the following morning. Their daughter was born in April of 1887. Arriving with considerably more speed and considerably less drama than Thomas had, in a dawn delivery that the entire event completed before the sun had fully cleared the eastern peaks, as if she was in a hurry to begin doing whatever she was going to spend her life doing. They named her Eleanor, after Abigail's mother, and she had from the first day the particular quality of watchful attention that suggested she was already cataloging information about her environment and developing theories. The summer survey project in 1887 was the summer that became, in the family mythology that all families develop whether they intend to or not, the definitive one, the one everything else was measured against. 6 weeks in the San Jacinto Mountains with a small survey crew, a 2-year-old who approached the mountain terrain with physical confidence that reduced his father to constant alert vigilance, and produced his mother's most precise risk assessment protocols, and a 3-month-old in a carrier that Abigail wore across her chest, and that Eleanor apparently found satisfactory. Because she slept through most of the Alpine survey work, and woke for meals with a punctuality that the survey schedule was quietly adjusted to accommodate. Stephen took a leave from the deputy position for 2 weeks of the 6 and rode the mountain with her, carrying Thomas when the terrain required it and learning, with genuine humility and genuine pleasure, the geology his wife could read from a hillside like text on a page. She taught him to read a contour map with real precision that summer, working through the fundamentals in camp in the evenings with Thomas asleep between them and Eleanor in her basket. And he learned with the same focused attentiveness that characterized his best work. And by the end of the 2 weeks, he could look at a topographical map and understand it in 3 dimensions in a way he never had before. "You're a good student," she told him one evening. "I have a good teacher," he said, and kissed her in the firelight in the manner of a man who has discovered that showing appreciation physically is more efficient than expressing it verbally, which she had no objection to. The survey was completed successfully and submitted to the Territorial Survey Office in Denver, where it was received as one of the most thorough and detailed cartographic works produced for the region to date. The lead geologist in Denver wrote a letter of commendation that described Abigail's methodology as exemplary and her documentation as setting a standard that the survey would use going forward. Abigail framed the letter and hung it in her study, beside the geological specimens from the Eastern Ridge and the photograph taken in Silver Creek in 1883 by the photographer who had been passing through, which showed her and Stephen and Emmett and Clara in front of Dr. Hensley's office looking tired and wind-burned and alive in the specific way of people who have survived something together. Stephen was made sheriff of Callow County in the autumn of 1888, when Cord Haynes retired to a small ranch south of town, where he could observe events without being responsible for any of them. Stephen took the position with the same quiet seriousness with which he had taken everything, and he moved the San Jacinto survey maps from the deputy's desk area to the sheriff's desk area, which was his statement about how he intended to do the job. That information mattered, and knowing the full territory, in all its dimensions and complexity, was the foundation everything else was built on. He hired a new deputy that same autumn, a young man of 23 named Garrett Wells, who had recently arrived from Nebraska with good recommendations and a willingness to learn. On Garrett's third day, Stephen pointed to the framed survey maps on the office wall and explained their origin and their content and their use, and then he said something that Garrett Wells would repeat for the rest of his career to anyone who asked about his first weeks in Callow. He said, "The most dangerous thing in law enforcement, or in any other field of work, is being certain about what you know. Be thorough and be thorough again, but always leave room for the map that someone else has been carrying. Because sometimes the person with the map that you don't have yet is the person who saves everyone, including you." Garrett Wells looked at the maps. "Who made these?" he said. "My wife," said Sheriff Stephen Fletcher, and the particular quality of pride in his voice was, by Garrett's account to anyone who later asked, something he had never heard precisely replicated in any subsequent human being. The winter of 1888 was the hardest winter the San Jacinto Valley had seen since before the settlers came, according to the old-timers who measured such things by the height of the drifts against the barn walls. 4 feet of snow fell in the first week of December alone, and the temperature dropped to levels that the mercury in the thermometers at the general store refused to register, and the mountain passes were sealed tight for the first 3 weeks of the month with the certainty of geography rather than the contingency of weather. Abigail rode Meridian into the mountains on the 14th of December, alone, on a clear day between storms, to check the condition of the eastern face path. She had been doing this periodically through the winter seasons since 1883, documenting the seasonal variations in the path's accessibility with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. The path was, she found, in better condition than she had expected after the early snows. The wind direction had been predominantly westerly, which meant the eastern face had less accumulation than the more exposed western approaches. The path was passable for single riders. She was making notes in her field notebook, sitting on Meridian at the upper approach to the path, when she heard a sound below her that did not belong to the mountain. A horse moving fast and without rhythm, which meant a horse in trouble or a horse carrying a rider who was in trouble. She put her field notebook away and turned Meridian toward the sound. It was a young boy of about 14, riding a horse that had come up lame on the left foreleg and was compensating with an uneven, lurching gait. The boy was pale and frightened and had a letter in his hand which he held up when he saw her as if it explained everything. "Ma'am," he said, I've got to get through to Silver Creek. Doctors needed. Urgent. She looked at the horse's foreleg, assessed the injury as muscular strain rather than structural, and made a decision in the time it took to take a breath. Get up behind me, she said. We'll take your horse on a lead and use the eastern path. There's no trail up there, he said. There is, she said. I know where it is. And so it happened again. Not the same emergency, not the same stakes, not the same people, but the same mountain and the same unmarked path and the same woman who knew where it was because she had been willing to look further and harder and more carefully than the assumption of impossibility had required. She got the boy through to the Silver Creek Road in 40 minutes and directed him to Dr. Hensley's office, which was still operating, and rode back through the pass alone in the early afternoon light, with the satisfaction of someone who knows that the knowledge they carry has purpose beyond the accumulation of it. When she arrived home in Callow, Thomas was sitting at the kitchen table with Stephen, who was supposedly helping him with his arithmetic but was, she could see from the doorway, mostly telling him stories about tracking in snow, and Alina was asleep on the settee in the sitting room under a blanket with a book she had been attempting to read lying open across her chest. Stephen looked up when she came in and registered, in the practiced way of a man who has been paying close attention to one person for 5 years, something in her face. Good ride, he said. Useful, she said. She took off her coat and hung it by the door and came to the table and looked at Thomas's arithmetic, which was coming along correctly if slowly. He needs to go through the multiplication tables again, she told Stephen. I know, Stephen said. We were getting there. She sat down at the table, pulling off her gloves and flexing her fingers against the cold, and she told them about the boy on the lame horse and the eastern path and the doctor in Silver Creek, telling it simply and without dramatization, as a fact of the afternoon. Thomas listened with the intent interest of a child who is hearing about real events in the real world that his parents inhabit. Alina slept through it on the settee. When she was finished, Thomas said, How do you always know where the trail is, Mama? She thought about how to answer this for a moment. Then she said, I walked it. In the summer of 1879 and 1880 and 1881. I walked it and I measured it and I wrote it down and then I remembered it. How do you know where to walk? He said. I look, she said, past the places where other people stopped looking. Stephen was watching her across the table, and the expression on his face was the one she would carry with her for the rest of her life as the definitive evidence that she had chosen correctly in everything, the expression of a man who loves what he sees so completely that it is no longer distinguishable from the way he sees. Past the places where other people stopped looking, he said quietly, repeating it not to test it but to keep it. It's how you find what isn't on the official map, she said. Like the path, Thomas said, nodding as if this confirmed a theory he had already been developing. Like the path, Abigail agreed. The years settled into Callow the way years do in mountain country, not gradually but in layers, each winter adding to the stratigraphy of what had been built. Stephen served as sheriff of Callow County for 12 years, and in that time the valley grew in population and in complexity, and in the range of problems it brought to the sheriff's office, and he managed all of it with the practical intelligence and the fundamental decency that had always been his primary tools. He was not a perfect lawman. He made mistakes. He told Abigail about them in the evenings with the same directness with which he told her about his successes, because honesty was the foundation of everything between them, and he was not interested in presenting an edited version of himself to the person who knew him best. She was not a perfect teacher. She expected too much sometimes, ran ahead of where her students were, mistook preparation for progress. Stephen told her this when she asked, with equal directness, because that was the agreement between them, and she received it the same way she received all accurate information, as something useful. In 1891, when Thomas was 6 and Alina was 4, they had a third child, a son they named William Emmett Fletcher, Emmett for Clara's grandfather, who had died the previous year of natural causes at 69, with Clara holding one hand and the account ledger of his cattle ranch in the other, because he had wanted to leave his affairs in order and he had managed it. William came into the world with a disposition so sunny and untroubled that it seemed to be making a philosophical argument about temperament, and he grew up to be the easiest person in a household of intense, highly capable, determinedly complex individuals. Abigail continued her cartographic work throughout the 1890s, completing 2 additional commission surveys for the Colorado Territorial Survey and consulting on 2 more, and the body of work she accumulated across those years became, eventually, a reference that geographers and surveyors working in the San Jacinto region were still citing into the following century. She knew this would happen, not from vanity, but from the same accurate assessment she brought to everything. The work was good because she had done it carefully and completely, and good work persists. Clara Duchamp, who never forgot the January morning when an unmarked trail through the San Jacinto Mountains saved her life, became a mathematics teacher in Denver at the age of 22, and later a lecturer at the Colorado State Normal School, and later still the author of a textbook on secondary mathematics that was used in schools across 3 territories. She visited Callow once a year for as long as she lived, and she always brought something for Thomas and Alina and William, and she always sat in Abigail's study for at least one long afternoon, talking about everything, and she always left renewed. The schoolhouse in Callow was expanded in 1893, adding 2 rooms and a proper library, and the library was named the Winslow Room, a designation that the town council proposed, and Abigail accepted with the specific combination of genuine pleasure and mild embarrassment that characterized her relationship with public recognition. The naming ceremony was attended by every family in the valley and by Sheriff Stephen Fletcher, who stood in the back of the room during the speeches with his arms crossed and an expression of such unabashed pride that at least 4 people in the immediate vicinity felt it necessary to look at something else for a moment. He was 52 years old and still the most physically present person in most rooms he entered, not from intimidation, but from the quality of attention he brought to everything, the sense that whatever he was doing, he was fully in it. The gray had come into his dark hair at the temples in his 40s, and he wore it without concern, because he was not a man who spent meaningful energy on appearance, and Abigail had told him once, with complete sincerity, that she found the gray as appealing as everything that had preceded it, which he had received with a smile that still, after all the years, reorganized her internal landscape. She was 51, and she was, in the opinion of anyone who had known her in those early years in Callow and knew her still, exactly the person she had always been, with the additions that a life fully lived accumulates, the fine lines and the silver in the auburn hair, and the depth of knowledge in those green eyes that had seen the San Jacinto Range in every season and every weather, and had documented it all with love as much as precision. They sat on the porch of their house on autumn evenings when the temperature was still bearable, watching the light change on the mountain faces, and they talked about whatever was current and whatever was permanent and occasionally about nothing at all, which was the most luxurious form of conversation, and the mountains stood above the valley as they had always stood, indifferent to human time, but holding within their folds the paths that human knowledge had found, and the unmarked trails that human care had documented, and the geography of a life built with intention and honesty and love. One October evening in 1894, when the aspen groves above the timberline had gone their particular, vivid gold and the air had the crystalline clarity that preceded the first real frost, Thomas came out onto the porch where his parents were sitting and announced that he wanted to study geology at the Colorado School of Mines, which had been operating in Golden since 1874, and he wanted to know if that was possible. Stephen looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at Thomas, who was 9 years old and had been collecting rock specimens since he was 3, and could identify the major geological formations of the San Jacinto Range by sight at 7. "The Colorado School of Mines," she said. "That's an excellent institution. It's a real school," Thomas said, with the earnestness of a child making an argument he has prepared. "For real geology, not just reading about it. You have several years before that would be relevant," Abigail said. "But yes, if that is what you want to study and where you want to study it, then that is what you will do." Thomas went inside, satisfied, and Stephen looked at Abigail in the particular evening light and said nothing for a moment. "He got that from you," he said. "The geology or the certainty about what he wants?" "Both," Stephen said. "Definitely both." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, which was not a gesture she made often, because she was not, constitutionally, a person who performed sentiment, but when she made it, it was real in a way that went past performance into something more essential. He put his arm around her and they sat like that in the October evening, watching the mountain light change, and the valley below them was full of the lives they had touched, and the work they had done, and the paths they had found through the places where other people had stopped looking, and it was enough, and it was more than enough. And in the language of the mountains, which do not measure time in years but in the slow, absolute accumulation of what endures, it was the kind of permanence that outlasts the asking. The unmarked trail was still there. Every year when the winter came and the avalanche paths sealed the official routes and the mountain seemed impassable, it was there. Abigail had showed it to Garrett Wells when he was promoted to sheriff, after Stephen retired, and had ridden it with him twice, so he knew the approach points and the exposure zones and the seasonal variation in surface conditions. She had shown it to the man who succeeded Garrett Wells. She had drawn it into every updated edition of her San Jacinto maps with the same clear line she had drawn in 1880, always with the notation that gave it its full context. The notation read, "Seasonal game path, traditional Ute route. Documented August 1880 with assistance of N, whose knowledge of this terrain exceeds that of any subsequent surveyor. Path navigated in emergency conditions January 16, 1883. Passable for single riders and small pack groups in moderate winter conditions. Western exposure demands assessment of wind and accumulation before commitment, not on official maps. Knowledge of this route has preserved lives. AWF Abigail Winslow Fletcher." The name that held both what she had been and what she had chosen to become, not in replacement of each other but in accumulation, the way the mountain adds layer to layer and becomes, over time, something greater than any single stratum. The trail was there, and the knowledge of it was preserved, and the people who had been saved by it were still living their lives in the valley below, and the woman who had found it was sitting on her porch in October with the man who had once told her there was no trail, and had then said lead the way with a simplicity and a humility that had been the beginning of everything worth having in both their lives. It was enough. It was exactly, precisely, completely enough.